And carriers have concerns about NFV security as their networks become more reliant on open source technologies and protocols. From the Dell TIA NOW studio here at TIA 2016 Network of the Future, we'll explore how carriers are approaching open source and the burgeoning NFV security space. Here in the studio is Bryan Larish. He's SDN NFV Architecture Planning, or with the planning group at Verizon. He's also chair of TIA's NFV Security Working Group. Also with us and next to him is Ken Garrard. He's Chief Executive Officer at Aunigma Network Solutions Corporation. And on the end of our panel here is our own Franklin Flint, Chief Technology Officer at the Telecommunications Industry Association. And gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here. I want to start off, Ken, if you don't mind, I'll start with you. I want to really ask you sort of the 70 or 80,000 foot question. Well, actually, maybe it's not that, depending on how you answer it. What are really the main concerns around NFV security right now?
Well, IT and cybersecurity is a very broad subject, and I'm sure everybody would agree that there's a lot of moving parts to it. I'd say because this group is here to address some of the foundations of baking in the security from the start is a really important fashion.
Yeah, and I think the good news from a carrier perspective is that a lot of the underpinning technologies that we're looking at for SDN NFV, they're sort of well-known things that have been looked at in other parts of the IT industry. So for example, hardening Linux or best practices for secure deployment of apps. I think that's the good news. There's a lot of work for us to build on. It's just how do we now tailor that to the telco and carrier specific space for our sort of unique concerns.
Yeah, there is a lot of that. We do look at the gaps that already exist, but there's also, as you mentioned, a lot of work that's already been done and a lot of trust that's been built into other markets that have a need for very secure solutions based on open source. And I think there's an education level that needs to take place as well in the industry, just to reduce that fear a little bit, because it's very justifiable when you talk about open source. All that code's out there for anyone to look at. It's easy to be afraid of that. And I think there's just a transition point of getting comfortable with what's out there and what's available to be able to address that fear so that we can start deploying and seeing the benefits of having this stuff in the field.
Absolutely.
Bryan, so as a carrier, and to Franklin's point, when you talk about NFV security and also open source, how do you as a carrier answer that question when people ask you about that?
Yeah, so I think the bottom line is for Verizon, like many carriers, right? We're in a new world, we're all on the learning curve trying to figure out how to do this in the best way we can. At the end of the day, security is an important part of our network planning process, and we're going to implement that and do it in a way to continue to deliver the best service possible. But that being said, I think some of the things that we're trying to do internally, some of the ways we're trying to mitigate risk is sort of look at it in a structured approach and say, all right, you know, for NFV security, I have two pieces. I have the how do I secure the infrastructure, which is using a lot of those well-known techniques and tools that are available today. But also, how can I use this new infrastructure and the control and the flexibility I have to implement new security capabilities that weren't possible before? And so we're trying to sort of balance those two things and come up with the overall risk assessment of how we go forward. But I think at the end of the day, we're seeing this as a new opportunity for doing things better, doing things we couldn't do before as part of our network.
Yeah, and to that point, there's a lot of capabilities that NFV bring to the table that companies like Verizon and your competitors can bring to market and offer your customers to set up their own networks and their own services and their own capabilities, which have a huge financial benefit for everyone involved. People are willing to pay to be able to do that. You're able to make some money off of that, and that's great. But once you start freeing up your network for people to play with, you've got to make sure it's secured and in a way that people don't do harm to other people's networks or to other services that are out there.
Certainly.
Now, Bryan, of course, you're the head of chair of TIA's NFV Security Working Group. And this is actually a question for Franklin, but I wanted to preface it by mentioning that again, as I did in the introduction. Franklin, are you and Bryan typically on the same page when you're talking about NFV security and open source? Are you aligned, or are there conflicting sort of opinions and thoughts?
No, I think we're all aligned. I think the whole industry recognizes what the problems are. The thing we're running into is that a lot of the suppliers feel like they've solved the problems because of the data center work they've done, the work they've done with banking institutions, with national intelligence agencies and things like that, that make them go, well, hey, we've already done this, trust us, right? They would like to be able to say that. But on the flip side, once a carrier explains a little bit why they don't necessarily trust them, it's easy to go, oh, yeah, I get it. I can see why you're questioning us about how secure this stuff is. And so it gives us the opportunity in our working group, one, to address the known solutions and the known best practices and the things that can be done, make sure everyone's comfortable with that, but then find those gaps that still need to be filled, as we mentioned earlier. There are some things that may be unique to a carrier network that still need to be addressed.
To that point, Ken, as far as gaps in the industry, as far as NFV security education, can you add on to anything that Franklin mentioned about those gaps?
As far as education, I think that because the pervasiveness of attacks that are happening today, that a lot of people don't understand how they're orchestrated. I think that helps educate the telcos, the organizations, the vendors on what areas they need to concentrate for next-gen security.
Yeah, and I think that you can't emphasize that education piece enough, because when you're talking about this kind of fundamental change to any large enterprise, especially a carrier, these changes have such a wide-ranging impact of the number of people, the number of organizations, the number of processes, the things that have to sort of get caught up to that. And so the more you can get people educated, the more you can get them comfortable with it, the easier that process is, instead of it just being sort of an emotional reaction of, open source, oh my gosh, there's all these issues. When you go through that education process, you can start focusing on the things that sort of Franklin mentioned and that we've talked about earlier, is the new capabilities you can bring to bear and all the opportunities and possibilities you have when you start doing these new things.
Yeah, and along those lines, we've been so caught up and excited about the possibilities of what NFV brings to the table and whether or not it can technically do the things that the thought leaders say it should be able to do. As that's all being developed and everyone's getting excited about that, every now and then in those meetings, in those strategy sessions, someone says, well, what about the security? And everyone goes, oh my goodness, we haven't thought about that. That's like the elephant in the room that everyone's afraid of. Well, now that we're getting closer to deployment schedules, we got to step up and start talking about this stuff. And an association like TIA gives us that ability to bring people together and have that conversation. Other orgs are also doing that. And I think it's time to start addressing that as an industry, so that it's no longer just the elephant in the room, it's something that's being talked about and we're really getting things done.
Certainly.
Well, speaking about what we're talking about here at TIA 2016, and I'll go down the line here and ask you sort of this quick question. Franklin, I'll start with you. NFV security concerns and issues, what do you think we'll be talking about this time next year?
I think next year we're going to start seeing actual deployments and people giving us reports on the issues that we didn't address and say, oh, okay, we rolled it out and this happened. No one foresaw that. And so we have to address that in a way that's more effective and start anticipating more of those. I think there'll be some of that going on. I still think we'll be talking about everything we're talking about now, because we are still at the infancy of seeing the capabilities of NFV being deployed and used in the market. I think those are the two big things we'll be looking at.
Ken?
I second that. It's still a very wide open field to study, to try to figure out where to get started and to evolve it from over the next 5 years.
Right.
Yeah, so I'll put on my hat for the chair of the TIA NFV Security Working Group for this one. And I think one of the things we're really looking to do is come up with concrete guidelines, processes for how do you deploy this stuff in a secure way. How can you assess whether or not it's secure enough to go on your network? So if you look at routers or switches or any equipment we deploy on our network today, there's a set of hardening guidelines, there's a set of best practices, there's a set for the security team to evaluate the security. And so I think when we're sitting here a year from now, as Franklin said, we're at the beginning of the journey, but we're going to be a lot farther down the path of having those kind of tangible things that the operators and the telcos can use to get started with SDN NFV.
And you can't underestimate all of the people that are going to try to break these networks for either nefarious reasons or as white hatters just to show the vulnerabilities. I think there's things we're going to discover that we weren't anticipating.
Well, it's good to see this. The security component is more of the discussion around NFV. I'm glad that TIA is involved in leading that charge, and Franklin's at the helm of that. So we appreciate that. Ken, it was good to meet you. Thanks for being with us.
Same here.
And Bryan, again, it's good to put a face with all the emails that I'm CC'd on as well. Not involved, but I do see them, and you're a smart guy. Okay, I'll say that. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks.
Thank you.
All right, and once again, thank you for joining us at TIA 2016 right here from the Dell TIA NOW studio. For more coverage, please visit tianow.org. So long.